touch. Taking a score for a moment to go.
Well, yeah, we were in a very lucky position in that we were invited to become involved. So we were written into the brief by John Hopkins when the design tenders, the competition was set up. So to some extent we were going to be involved with whichever combination of practices got the job. And that was because of our track record and the, I guess, reputation that we had in previous work for delivering very innovative and exciting planting. And John and the ODA said, well, that's the sort of thing we want to have in the Olympic Park.
One of the things we did is we wrote a book in 2004 called The Dynamic Landscape. And really, in a sense, that was our sort of like mission statement for how we saw the world. And I think that sort of really sort of matched up with probably John's view of how the Olympic Games was to be. So that was our calling card, really. Well, we did the work through the consultancy agency within the University of Sheffield for a whole variety of reasons, but not least that the ODA were very keen because they have a lot of indemnity cover if things go horribly wrong, and of course not that would ever happen. So we simply worked through that. So we didn't really have to get involved in the nitty-gritty of contracts. We just have to send a form off to the consultancy office. Quite nice, really. In terms of, if you want to sort of like, let's split it into elements, really. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of overlap between Nigel and I on some things, and then there were clear areas of where we're essentially working pretty much independently of one another. And in terms of my input, as we said before, we took the gardens, and I worked on two of them, the South African one and the North American one. And that was mainly because they relate to my academic research interests. I've been developing those as planting community models for about the last 10, 15 years. So I did those two with Sarah, and then in the broader park, we conceptualised quite a few of the native plant communities together, but then in terms of implementation on the ground, I tended to lead on the perennial seeded vegetation. So that's all of the native wildflower meadows. It's the swales, etc., some of the woodland understory, even though we co-designed some of the mixes for those together. Whereas Nigel, your input was the other half.
Well, yeah, so mostly in South Park, the annual meadows, the golden meadows around the stadium, and in the gardens, the Europe garden and the Asia gardens with Sarah.
And the way that sort of process works in terms of the dynamic, perhaps particularly the most complex to untangle really are the gardens, because you have LDA and Hargreaves essentially designing the spatial form, although the spatial form, is inevitably a ribbon because you've got sandwiched between the river and the concourse. And then you've got Sarah working either with Nigel or myself. And the way it sort of worked is as I sort of developed the overall concept for the journey from the Renaissance of areas of the world that the British were interested in as gardening people on taking plants from. So we did Eastern Europe in the Near East. That's the first garden, and then we moved to essentially in the 17th century on North America, and then we moved to Southern Hemisphere essentially in the 18th century, and then we get to Asia in the 19th century. We're still very keen on Asia type thing. So I did that bit, and then I developed the planting palettes for those two areas, South Africa and North America, and then I work with Sarah, and she essentially develops the internal spaces in the gardens to actually facilitate the existence of where those mixes go, and she adds her own overlay, which is to add more cultural patterns onto the random planting mixes which I essentially design and specialise in.
It's the same. So we sort of develop the plant lists, the combinations, the overall, I guess, concept of the combinations of the plants in terms of the random mixtures, and then Sarah put the detail in terms of the layers and the structure.
The random mixes, the idea is that in the gardens fundamentally you've got this overall narrative about the British are gardening people through time, which is like the linear message, and then within the gardens you've essentially got the idea of, hey, The random planting bits that they've just been showing on the telly, for example, they are meant to be an idealised sort of piece for example, South Africa, that, you know, as people would have seen it when they first went there, the first Europeans. And then we take that, and then we take the same species and we organise them in cultural patterns. So each garden is a sort of conversation, essentially, between nature as it is and what we as human beings do with. I don't know if anyone got that in terms of the. That was the idea, anyway.
It's one of the key principles, but in a slightly different way to maybe how more purist ecologists would take that, in that I suppose we would see very much, and a really important part of what we've done in the park, particularly in the gardens, is that a very diverse horticultural planting, which might include native species, might include non-native species, can be fantastic for supporting native fauna, invertebrates, and so on. As opposed to saying, well, if you really want to support native fauna, you can only work with native plant species, and more so, you can only work with plant combinations that might have grown together on your particular site in the past before it was developed. And so I think really what we want to try and get across more than anything else with the gardens is that horticulturists, gardeners, ordinary people can do a huge amount for wildlife by having a very diverse, flower-rich, multi-layered surroundings, both in their own gardens, but also trying to promote that as much as possible within the wider urban environment.
I mean, I had a bit of a subtext in my involvement in the gardens, in that there's been a lot of research done over the last decade which has shown that domestic gardens are fabulously rich in native invertebrates, even when they're completely full of non-native species. Fabulously rich. And I didn't want the idea of the North Park as being a bit of rural countryside. All the invertebrates live up there, and none of them live in the South Park because they're full of all of these alien weeds. Because that's simply wrong. It's not like that. It's not how it is. That's historically how we've believed it to be, but the science now shows it isn't like that. And so, in a sense, that was sort of an ideas legacy we wanted to get across, because we think those ideas are really fundamental in landscape architectural practice, because, you know, we already have landscape systems in cities which are very good for nature, and they're called the domestic garden. You know, we haven't got necessarily to invent another form of that. We might choose to do so, but we have it already, but we don't recognise it. We think those places are sort of empty of wildlife, but they're not. They're fabulously rich.
Another example, the flowering annual meadows around the stadium and beyond, which you can walk through for 5 or 10 minutes continuously. They're the sort of biggest example of those that have been done. They've been flowering for a couple of months now. We're at sort of middle of August. Been flowering since the middle of June. They've got another couple of months left in them. They are probably the best food resource for pollinating insects that there is. And
in London.
In London.
Perhaps South East England.
This massive one. And they're particularly important because they will carry on flowering for 4 or 5 months, and particularly for late flying insects, when a lot of our native plant species are finished. And so if more and more people did this sort of thing, we would start to really address some of the issues there are with loss of pollinating insects in cities, and it's fantastic for people. It's really exciting.
In the world of invertebrates, it's a bit like supermarkets. You know, they stay open late. It's very good. You know, the longer you stretch the season of being able to get your milk from, the more you can support. It comes down to those simple things. It's not about magic. It's about resources availability. It's not about passports.
To some extent, it's been, from my point of view, of course it's been horrible for most people, the very cold and wet conditions for months and months on end. However, they've been perfect plant growing conditions, and earlier in the year our main concern was that we were going to have a huge drought because of the water restrictions in London. All the predictions were that we'd be going through the summer with massive problems with no water, and we'd be having to look at irrigation and really desperately trying to keep things growing, whereas the opposite turned out to be the case. Now, it started to get a bit too much, in that the conditions were so good that it's really pushed things along, a lot of fast growth and big growth. And we were very lucky, really, that the week before the games started, we had beautiful summer weather, brought all the flowers out. So in some ways, really, I think it's been almost perfect conditions for the plantings, although not so good for the people.
The only if in my response to that would be is that one of the problems I had is to get the native wildflower meadows to flower on cue at their peak for the Olympic Games. Now that's about a month later than they would normally do it naturally. We had to have a strategy to delay their flowering by approximately 4 weeks. And the way we did that, we did quite a lot of research on this, on the park, in the years running up to the Games. And what we found out is if we cut them down to the ground, sort of say 12 weeks before the Games, we could then delay their flowering as they made new flowering buds, etc., so that they would look pristine for the Games. But of course, when you have such a wet, cold spring, it made calibration of that approach, because I had to make the call, cut it all off. So it was all growing nicely, and I had to then say, we're going to cut 10 hectares of it off. We're going to get rid of the landscape. And that was a bit nervy, because with the weather, it might have mean we missed.
I think the other issue as well is with the 2012 gardens, that part of this naturalistic planting is that a little bit of meanness, a little bit of leanness within the soil or the climate is good, because you really start to accentuate the contrast in textures and forms. And I think perhaps last year we did get a lot of that, and we do have that still in the South African garden, but maybe in the others, because everything has gone on so well, we've lost some of the differentiation perhaps that we would have got if it had been a bit leaner and meaner in terms of the
I kept saying to the head gardener, you're fertilising those, aren't you? You're fertilising, you've got to stop. And of course, yeah, I mean, I would prefer to be much harder looking than it is typically. But
I don't think visitors would really know the difference, but I think
No.
from our point of view, it's looking a bit too lush in places.
it would look more authentic to the original wild spirit of the wild place if it was a bit harder and tighter looking. It does look as if, it's been to the supermarket rather too much in some cases.
I would say partly, but a lot of the work we've done really, whether it's in the gardens or the wider park, is, in terms of its naturalistic structure, very repetitive, and it works on a large scale. However, one of the great things about this sort of work is that you can look at a small scale example, whether it's the sort of meadows we work with or the gardens, and almost a few square metres is absolutely full of detail and beauty, whereas 1,000 square metres gives you this sense of repetition and scale. And that means that these things work in quite small spaces as well as in large spaces. And so it's largely just a sort of magnification of scale of the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Obviously a lot of our work with similar things is done on a smaller scale, because this is a unique project, and the techniques and the principles can be applied on a much smaller scale. Here, the resources allow us to do it. There's huge teams of contractors. Everything has to be made to work. In the real world, it's a little bit less intensive than that, and the techniques that we have are very applicable to that. So I think we've been spoiled in a way with this site, in that everything has been, there's a plan A, a plan C, a plan D to make sure it doesn't fail. But one of the, I think, reasons we were originally asked to become involved with this sort of work is that our backgrounds are about making things for very challenging situations where you don't have this level of resource, and it has to work in a fairly neglected sort of environment.
Yeah, I mean, in essence, the sort of the form of the vegetation we make is a bit like cloth. So it's just a square metre multiplied over and over and over again. It's like Harris tweed or something, really, to a degree. And then you change the cloth and you have something different type thing. I think many of the things we've done here, they can be applied elsewhere. I think the thing to remember at the Olympic Park is an awful lot of artificial things were created in the Olympic Park, so there's a lot of requirements. For example, we had to try, with the perennial native wildflower meadows, we had to get the plants big enough to flower, and also get them big enough so we could then cut them to the ground, and I make them smaller, so they can still get them to flower. So we had to jump through a lot of hoops, pushing them, pulling them, which on an ordinary site, you could adopt a much more relaxed form of management. So in one sense, the intensive management was created by the time scale that has to look good on the 27th, etc., etc. So that's an important point, I think, really. I mean, there were some advantages here, obviously. I mean, one of the things we could do is, we could bring in, for example, there was no soil. Originally we thought we'd probably be working with crushed building rubble, modified with composted green waste, but then all of the crushed building rubble went under the stadium or elsewhere in engineering work, so then we had to have something, so eventually we brought in various essentially modified sands. And because of that, for example, we could pull in material from deep quarries that had no weed seed banking, so no seeds of weeds in the soil. So it meant you could engineer things and you could almost exclude all of those species that you would normally have in any topsoil. And you could also make the plants grow very, very slowly in the long term, so that they wouldn't invade with very weedy sort of rank species, and they will keep their quality for the next sort of 50 years. So we've been able to guarantee those things, for example, the native wildflower meadows, because of the site. Now, on many urban sites, you have to work much more with what you have, and so that forces you to have perhaps slightly different objectives. But I mean, when I walk around the North Park and I see some of the native wildflower meadows, I mean, you could reduce flower density by 50%, and people would still think those things were, fantastic. I mean, they are just surreally wow.
Well,
some of those systems.
I think that is the other element of this, about its applicability on different scales or different sites. I think that if there was ever any evidence needed that people absolutely love a flower-rich, colourful environment, this is it. I mean, I think we knew what to expect to some extent, but I think even we have been amazed and surprised at the public response. And I think if anybody was to argue now that this is the sort of thing that people don't like, it would just be crazy. But more than that, the level of response and involvement with people with this sort of landscape that has been created here is just totally different to if they go out a nice garden or a nice park where you might be sort of say, oh, that's lovely, that's nice. Here, people are absolutely flabbergasted. They're absolutely amazed by it. And I think, to me, that is saying, well, this must be done elsewhere. It really must be applied elsewhere.
Well, we've been working to this position for about a few years now, because historically, actually, in landscape architecture, colour hasn't really been seen as really terribly important. It's all been about texture, and rather sort of the big bang of modernism, less is more type thing. Whereas our experience of working with people on the ground, if you like, is that it's very obvious as soon as you do something. Nigel's done huge amounts in disadvantaged communities, and as soon as you create that colour, people go from being incredibly cynical and hostile to just like puppies. They absolutely adore it and love it, and it has made me realise that a lot of landscape architecture needs to engage much more with the power of things like colour, and that it's no point in doing things which are very modest and gentle. If you really want to engage people in the sense of nature, if you give them lots of colour, like on a wildflower calendar, they adore it. It's a bridge they can really cross over to, and it doesn't require any learnt knowledge. You don't have to read The Guardian. Don't have to do any of those things. We can all do it.
So that's the problem with a lot of sort of ideas in green infrastructure in a way, is that it's green.
It's green, it's green,
and
it's
wild and green, and
it's very worthy. It's very worthy. But it is, because a lot of these things are like knowledge cults. And in reality, my own personal view is that we need to be much more tied into like a vernacular agenda of people who are not us. And we know from our work, both in practice and in terms of dealing with environmental psychology and that, that things like colour are just so incredibly powerful. And you see it in their eyes. You walk out there, they just stagger around and say, oh my God, But if it was all green, they'd be wandering around saying, what's this? They would, literally. It's as simple as that. It's just a switch you throw.
We've sort of worked in different parts, so with different contractors. I work with Willoughby's a lot, who are responsible for the annual meadows and the gardens. And I think for both of our point of view to begin with, the contractors hadn't really done anything like this before. It was completely alien to them. And I certainly felt quite a lot of resistance, because we both had to actually stand there and show how to sow seeds, sort of very low tech, sort of handfuls of seed mixed with sawdust and strewn around. And sort of that's very low tech for people who are used to driving tractors and operating machinery. So I certainly felt there's a group of contractors when I first started were sort of looking at me saying, what on earth is he doing? And what is this person coming in from University of Sheffield? But very quickly, as soon as it starts to work, the attitude changed. And I don't think we could have wanted a better group of contractors to work with, because they have become as much involved in it as we have in a way, because they're here all the time. And certainly with Willoughby's, they've been the ears and eyes on the ground. They know what to expect, and they certainly are always in dialogue with us about raising issues. So I think there's the sort of degree of skill has been developed within the contracting teams that has, I suppose, enabled them to become quite autonomous in a way.
Yeah, look, the contractors are incredibly important. I mean, they are the needle through which the camel must pass, essentially, type thing. And again, like Nigel, my first meeting with the two contractors I worked with, and it was actually, it was a very robust thing. I think they thought, my God, this person's been sent to make our lives miserable and wretched, because we were dealing with this unfamiliar territory, and they were genuinely, I think, scared about the people who had signed up to deliver this with very little experience. But again, same with Nigel. I mean, I trained all of the contractors in the North Park to sow, because we sowed it all by hand, because the slopes are too steep to use machines, and machines don't really do it very well, to be honest. And actually, once you got the guys on side, and once you motivate, and once they began to believe in you, and that you were just some sort of crazy, then actually they did take huge ownership and a huge sense of pride. And I mean, I've seen a few of them in the last few months, and give them a big hug and said, "You did this," and they were really, really chuffed about what they did to do it. So the contractors are incredibly important. I think they have I hope they've got a huge amount out of this, as well as us getting a huge amount out of them.
I think they've had a quite important role this year as well, because obviously the stuff we do is a big experiment. I mean, nothing like this has been done before, and a lot of the, should we say, people high up within the ODA or LOCOG, I think got very jittery earlier in the year about, is this going to work, or isn't this going to work? When you look at what, to all intents and purposes, looks like a lot of weeds coming up, and so I think the contractors in place here had a role to play in sort of saying, calm down, don't worry, things are going to work. And I know that there were some quite last-minute jitters about, well, should we turf over this area, should we put asphalt down, which the contractors on site said, no, have a bit of patience, trust us, it's going to work. So I think that was a very important role.
I think one of the things, bearing in mind, if you just forget about the Park for a second, you just take a broader view of contractors in landscape architecture. I mean, one of the to have a really functioning landscape architecture, then what you need to have really well-trained contractors who recognise, that what it's really about is, it's not about doing things on the spec. It's actually about achieving the outcomes that are desired. And a lot of, and I think historically, a lot of landscape contractors have seen their role as to do what they're told to do. And what you really need is, you need contractors who actually have the same values as you. Yes, we are in this together. Our role is to make it work. It's not what we do. It's actually what we achieve. And that's the fundamental bridge, if you want to, the contractors need to cross over to, if we're going to be able to do things really successfully in the future.
Well, a big innovation is that apart from the gardens, this is largely a seeded landscape, which is very different to the normal way a park or an urban landscape might be created. So that has its risks, of course, because you don't have the certainty of putting plants in particular positions, but it does deliver this very spontaneous effect that allows large areas, huge areas, to be done relatively cost effectively. And it must be the biggest seeded landscape that's been done on this sort of technique.
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's at least 10 hectares of what you might call perennial certain vegetation, and by the time you add in the annuals, there must be another 3-4 at least.
Yeah.
So that's 20-30 football fields. It's a lot of stuff. I think one of the really, from a design point of view and on the bigger scale, one of the really innovative things about the park is that if you analyse what landscape parks or urban landscapes are normally about, generally speaking, the ratio is they're mostly dominated by mown grass, and there's a little bit of hard surfacing, and that's basically the balance. If you look at the Olympic Park, the balances are inverted in that most of the surface area that you don't walk on is some sort of meadow or some species-rich plant community, small amounts of lawn, very large areas of hard surface, but they will eventually disappear in transformation, and you will have this dominance. So I think that's the big change, because the default vegetation in landscape architecture is always mown grass. You know, if you haven't got enough money or whatever, it becomes mown grass, and it's a very functional but very sterile and sort of in many ways surface. Whereas what we've done here is we've created something in which you've got this huge expanses of things, which is sort of like Willy Wonka sort of experience type thing. And that's, to me, that's the big change. That's the real paradigm shift.
I guess as well the idea of what we call a visual ecology, so this idea of having the aesthetic considerations as important as the pure ecology considerations, but we're all trying to deliver the biodiversity outcome. So again, it's the most high profile example of where an aesthetic approach to ecology has been taken, I think, in this country, but maybe elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Oh, the biggest challenge. Sleepless nights. Let me think. For me, I think the biggest challenge was probably the implementation phase, because in 2000 we started sowing the wildflower meadows in January 2011. We were meant to do them before Christmas, but the project was running behind schedule, so we started then. They begin to germinate in spring, and then of course, for a variety of reasons, although the whole of the park has temporary irrigation in it, so theoretically we could keep it all moist to get controlled germination, and then basically there was the irrigation system wasn't joined up to the mains. So for the first few months the only irrigation we had was from abstraction from the river, and it was a very hot, dry spring 2011, and that was very like Waterloo. That was a pretty close run thing, and then it turned wet, and people got eventually on top of some sort of irrigation provision. So that was very close. There could have been a lot of turfing over, and that for me was the most difficult thing. The other thing that was difficult too is just working with these very low nutrient substrates. We have this material on the park called low nutrient topsoil. It's basically sand with some composted wood fibre in it. It's extremely nutrient efficient. It's almost got no nutrients in it whatsoever. So plants grow glacially slow on it. But we did this to try to guarantee the sustainability of these communities in the long term. By being lean and mean, you keep the aggressive species like grasses from coming in. But it was incredibly difficult to get the material to grow fast enough on this site, so we had to do all sorts of pushing with fertilisers. And it was new territory for me. I'd never really had to do that. I'd never done so much like ringmastering, push, pull, and how fast is too fast, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was new territory for me.
Yeah, I think what we alluded to before is having a very tight time frame in which this has to look good, but although July the 27th was given to us as the absolute deadline, of course the park was in use by journalists and visiting groups for maybe a month, 6 weeks beforehand, so it had to look good then. And it really, for me, and I think for both of us as well, when you're involved in it, and it was very stressful. With the annual meadows, for example, they'd be looking great for weeks and weeks, and you think, well, are they going to sort of finish early and everything? It really was July the 26th where I felt I could sit back and relax and actually enjoy it for the first time.
We had a beer. We came down and had a beer. It was like a big celebration. And normally we just rush around with bits of paper writing things, and it was a good day, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think for me it felt like, well, the sheer enormity of the achievement really sunk in on that day, because you were able to sort of stand back from being involved in the nitty-gritty and just look back and say, well, wow, it's working.
Because it did make me think, oh God, I never thought about that before. What did we learn?
Well, I think don't panic was a big thing, because when so much is at stake, it is quite easy to panic. Things aren't going to work, but You just have to rely on your experience to say, well, actually things are going to come through, but also not to be complacent. So it's a combination between not panicking and sort of going over the top and sort of reacting too strongly, but also not being so laid back that you're not aware that things are really going to have some close looking at. So I think that's sort of those two things on a bigger scale have been quite important to me coming out of this.
I'm not sure I learned these. I think I probably knew this before we started, but I think for me the whole question of the dynamics of actually working with people who are not you, and the whole question of how do you get them to do what, broadly speaking, you want, and to actually be engaged. I think for me, I think all landscape architectural practice is about that. You know, how do you make it work? And it's a mixture of, and you really, you know, you've only got sort of a bit of pushing. It's very hard. You can't make people do things, and so I think, yeah, being engaged, try to motivate people, and sometimes give a sense of leadership. You know, sometimes you have to try to convince people that you know you do know what you're doing, because so that they'll sign up to do it. So I think those sort of communication, sort of human skills, really important. Pretty absolutely vital in a project like this, especially. You know, quite a lot of traditional landscape architecture, and of course it's, you know, it's design and might be done in a computer terminal, and then it's given to a contractor, and you see how close you get to the final vision. But with this sort of work, it's very much like it's about a process, and it's about sort of back and forwards, all this iteration all the time between you and the landscape and the contractors and this sort of stuff. So that's the big complex skill, I think, in a way, that iteration. Well, I think one of we might perhaps want to interleave on this a little bit as things come into our heads, but for me, I think it's a fantastic example of actually looking at what drives people's sort of, what people get out of a landscape, you know, how exciting it is to them. And I think just watching people and being on site when people have been here, I mean, it's convinced me more than ever, you know, that this idea about colour and vitality, and that is absolutely essential to make places rich for human beings.
I think it's that reinforcement. We kind of knew it already, but I mean, there's no better example of it here from what we see, just people's behaviour. I think a great thing about this is the level of documentation of approaches and methodologies that has had to be gone through here. Everything is pretty much recorded, and I think that is a great resource potentially for people who want to do this elsewhere, partly because we've been through it for several years, we've had tries at it year after year, we have learned from mistakes and sort of learned what works and what doesn't work, and I would hope that sort of experience, both through us and contractors and the wider body of people involved, could be applied elsewhere. I think also, coming back to James's point, there's a huge hunger for information from people who visit the site. And they're just sort of hanging around and listening to people and saying, what's that plan, what's that plan? And it comes back to this sort of recognition that people are genuinely enthused by this, which I don't think was recognised by LOCOG, who perhaps didn't think the park was that important in terms of visitor experience with the vegetation. And I think there's a sort of gap in terms of the interpretation and the level of information available to people to understand what there is in the park that could perhaps be looked at again in future, about satisfying this thirst for knowledge perhaps that people do have when they see such exciting things.
Yeah, I think the other things in the legacy that are important is, I think the park's a great example of where more or less, you know, what we hope would happen did actually happen. So in terms of achieving your objectives, I think it's very, very good, because, you know, on many landscape projects, you know, they never ever quite perhaps get to where you hope they're going to get to, especially and that's more true of, say, planting, because with built elements, you know, nearly always they do what they do, because it's pretty easy to specify what a finished and acceptable finish is. I mean, if you look in this room, it's very straightforward. It's much more difficult with vegetation because it changes through space and time, etc. But I think the game shows that, you know, having very high standards in terms of what is to be achieved, having ongoing involvement between specialists probably and generous contractors is really important, because, you know, holding their hand and mentoring them almost all the way through is really helpful to them and really helpful to the project. Very often people are involved at the beginning, but then they disappear. And I think the fact we had this continuity from conception to delivery, that's really, really important type thing, those specialist skills. I think the other thing too is it's allowed us to develop a lot of sort of technical approaches and specification approaches. And there's some things we did in this park which I would never do again because they didn't work as well as I thought they would. And there are other things which worked fantastically well. And because it was a very heavily engineer-led project with a lot of interesting specification, sometimes that was a real negative. For some of the contractors, they were terrified to do anything, even step an inch outside the specification. I would say to people, but I wrote the specification, and you're telling me I can't do this, So sometimes it did get slightly absurd, and I think there's a balance to be struck between too much specification and too little specification. So for me, in my own mind, it certainly made me think about how I would play these things in the future. And I think a lot of other people who worked on the project probably have the same experience.
One thing for me, in terms of landscape architecture in general, is a reinforcement of the value of plant-rich landscapes and the role of vegetation in design landscapes, because nobody here is pointing at the quality of the tarmac or the sort of detailing on a bench. The whole discussion is about the vegetation and planting. And South Park is very urban, but it's very plant-rich as well. And of course that's tied in with the whole sort of environmental agenda. But I think again it does emphasise that landscape architecture has kind of neglected that. And certainly our own experience of training landscape architects is that for many students coming in it's the most tricky subject for them, and there is quite a lot of antagonism perhaps to sort of getting really involved in the planting side. But again, the evidence of the response of the people here suggests that that really is what we should be looking at if we want to really put landscape architecture into the centre of things, which is what it is here.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean, I think that is the case. I mean, if you really, it's a corny expression, but there's excruciating expression, smiles on dials type thing that the recreation people like to use. I think, planting, when it works well, it does that sort of effortlessly and brilliantly type thing. And people really, and it's a sort of, and I think the reason that's so important for people is that it's a vernacular thing. Again, we're back to that. They're familiar with that. They don't need any knowledge to find a lot of colourful flowers attractive. They just do. They just do. Whereas a lot of other things that we do in landscape art, sometimes that requires some sort of learnt knowledge to be able to appreciate or understand that type of thing. So it's a really win-win if you get it right. Well, I think we went too low nutrient on the soils, and it's a bit like sort of Tibetan sort of prayer wheels. You turn them faster and faster, and you get ever closer to heaven. In the ecological world, there's a sort of belief you get more and more infertile until there's no fertility there, and you get closer and closer to heaven. It's like an ecological nirvana. There are no nutrients. Hallelujah, praise be. And I think we got the nutrient levels too low. And I think what we sort of confuse is we confuse the nutrient levels you might have in semi-natural systems which have been there for 100 years, 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, with the difficulty of actually starting with those nutrient levels. So in the future, I would like to have a little bit more nutrient in my ecological nirvana rather than a little fewer. But of course, normally we're dealing with sites which are very, very nutrient rich. But when you've got a chance to bring something in from scratch, I think I would be going for a few more nutrients than we did here. So it's a rather technical point, but it has made me realise, that you can take nutrient impoverishment too far.
Well, it's very difficult to imagine what it might be in 5 years' time, because the landform will still be there, but obviously the vegetation is going to be altered. And I think, as we've discussed before, it's going to be pushed back a little bit more to the sort of semi-natural state, whereas we've pepped it up for the visual side. So I don't know. I think part of the trick will be to still maintain that really exciting, colourful nature to the vegetation. And the danger is that gets lost in the sort of race to make it more natural in terms of the biodiversity action plan. So I would hope that level of excitement by visitors is maintained, but I can't necessarily see it it won't be the same level of visual excitement because it's going to change. So I don't know, I find it difficult to imagine, compared to seeing the visitors' reactions now and how excited they are, to imagining it in 5, 10, 15 years' time, when it's going to be a different place for a different sort of function. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I think it's because it's... I'm tied up with the response we get to the place now, and so it's difficult to imagine what it might be like in a different sort of context.
I mean, I would hope it will continue to be a place people will come to because there's something to look at. In that, hey, let's go to Olympic Park, it's looking fantastic. Oh, that'd be great. I think the challenges in that are going to be management infrastructure. Landscape parks or landscapes in general are only as good as the management they receive. And so the absolutely critical thing is that we don't lose some sort of sense of people. You need to have people managing this place who have some sort of vision. I know vision sounds a bit corny, it's a very overworked term, but if you in landscape maintenance and management, unless you can construct a vision of what you want something to be, then you've got no means of working towards that, and you just simply slosh around and you just lose the plot. And so you need someone who's in charge of management and maintenance to be able to continue to make that vision in the same way we had a vision for what we wanted to make, and therefore we were able to get there. If you ain't got any vision and you just see it as sort of doing what you did last year, then you very quickly degrade landscapes. And that requires a skill set, it requires some sort of intellectual sort of capacity. So I just hope they choose people to do this who can actually really be creative and lead on that. Otherwise it will spiral down.
To some extent, but only in a relatively short term. So in terms of the legacy and the ongoing, no.
I would hope that there would be an opportunity to contribute, perhaps even to write the maintenance plans for the various types of vegetation on that site. And that's something I often do as a consultant anyway, because that way one can at least build in at least the basic things that need to be done and can help people. But the best way to do that is not to write plans. I mean, plans are often quite therapeutic and et cetera, and good for the bank balance. But I mean, in actual fact, the most useful thing is actually to have so many days a year here working with the staff on the ground and mentoring them. That's what you need as well as some formalised things. That you can't get away from how fundamental that is. Working with people on the ground to help them see, give them feedback. That's much more powerful than just having a plan. Well, I mean, if you didn't have landscape architecture, then it would be, the role would be done by architects or planners or nature conservation people, and my God, it would look very different. So, it is, as I said, coming back to the beginning, we got the gig, if you like, because of the dynamic landscape, which constructs a vision of this relationship between nature and culture, which is beautiful but environmentally rich. Now, if John Hopkins wasn't a landscape architect, I suspect that would never have happened. So it looks as it does because of the mindset, the skills, etc. of landscape architecture. So it's a very, very different place to what it would be. So I think really, in a sense, I mean, who knows what it would look like if landscape architecture didn't exist as a species. But if you go to countries where landscape architecture is very poorly developed, and say it's dominated by an architectural view of the world, they don't make places like that.